The nation's top infectious disease doctor is contradicting the president, warning Americans that a declining coronavirus death rate is not an indicator of success. Dr. Anthony Fauci made those comments today during a Facebook Live event. It comes after President Trump touted his pandemic response, claiming 99% of COVID-19 cases are, quote, totally harmless.
It's a false narrative to take comfort in a lower rate of death. There's so many other things that are very dangerous and bad about this virus. Don't get yourself into false complacency.
Dr. Fauci went on to say the U.S. should try, quote, as best as possible to get children back to schools, but that officials need to adhere to local guidelines. President Trump is pushing for that type of return to normalcy. He and First Lady Melania Trump held a roundtable discussion earlier where they heard from educators and students about getting classrooms up and running again. Florida has already pledged to do so in August, despite seeing a nearly 40% recent spike in coronavirus hospitalizations. It's emerging as a hotspot as the U.S. nears 3 million confirmed cases nationwide. Meanwhile, the president is set to hold an outdoor rally in New Hampshire this weekend. His campaign says attendees will be provided hand sanitizer and masks at the event. For more, CBS News Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett joins me now. Hi there, Major. Welcome back to Red and Blue. So it has been more than a week since the last White House coronavirus task force briefing. And before that, there was a 2-month hiatus. Where exactly is the president's messaging on battling the pandemic right now?
Well, it's mixed in the sense that the president likes to hold on to and then elevate what he regards as positive statistics to let people know things aren't as bad as the media tell you they are with COVID-19. And the latest example of this phenomenon, if you want to call it that, Elaine, is this pointing to the mortality rate linked directly to the virus. And it is true that for the better part of 2 months, the weekly death toll has been declining. Back when I had a daily podcast called Debriefing the Briefing, we're retooling it and we'll reintroduce it in a couple of weeks, no longer a daily podcast. We were tracking those numbers every Wednesday. And the president is right. Those death rate numbers have been declining. And as the White House said last week, they're at a 2-month low. But as Dr. Fauci said, and this is the important part of the continuum of the coronavirus, that's not the only disruption. It is the most traumatic and worst disruption of all, death. What could be worse than that? But sickness is a disruption. Hospitalization, ICUs, clearly disruptive, but even positive tests are disruptive. They're disruptive to workplaces if they are reopening, meaning a restaurant or a small business of any kind. They are disruptive within a family. They are disruptive within a social circle. And the test rates, meaning confirmed positives, are rising in lots of states, 40 at last count. And in the states where this is most problematic, Arizona, Georgia, Florida, Texas, and California, at alarming rates, near geometric rates. So the president has had a tendency throughout this pandemic to latch on to a component of positivity. As he has said many times, he's the national cheerleader. He likes cheerleading for the country. But there's often so much around that thing that he is cheerleading about that is either not true or misleading in a way that can lead to bad behavior or lead to, as Dr. Fauci said, complacency. And there's not one medical expert I've talked to in this entire process, Elaine, that believes where we are now is a place of comfort or a place of reassurance with the virus, which means that the president's rhetoric about these things that are, from his point of view, positive and laudatory might be, in a clinical term, a false positive or not nearly as positive as he's presenting to the country.
Well, despite guidelines from the task force discouraging large gatherings, the president continues to hold campaign rallies and events where crowds do gather, like one this past weekend marking the 4th of July. Let's go ahead and listen to some of what he said.
We will never allow an angry mob to tear down our statues, erase our history, indoctrinate our children, or trample on our freedoms. We will safeguard our values, traditions, customs, and beliefs. We will teach our children to cherish and adore their country so that they can build its future.
So, Major, how does the protection of monuments, some of them Confederate generals, fit with the president's reelection strategy? And more broadly, what is it that campaign officials are saying about the polling data which show the president is out of sync at this moment with a majority of Americans when it comes to questions of racial inequality?
So let me take the back half of your question first, Elaine. What does the polling tell those who are closest to the president in the campaign? Well, a couple of things. One, the polls are real, the news is bad. The president is trailing in battleground states and by much larger margins than he was in 2016. The president doesn't want to believe that information. He routinely, I am told, in conversations with his top campaign officials, either dismisses that polling data or says it is fragmentary or momentary and won't last. And there is, if not frustration, a sense of resignation about this interaction with the president on this, from the professional's point of view, bad polling data, meaning not bad that it's improperly conducted. The news is bad. The reality of it is bad, and the president is slipping behind. And of course, all campaign pollsters disregard national poll numbers because they know they're not relevant. They are focused very much on state polling numbers, and the state polling numbers are bad. And Senate Republicans running for re-election know that they're bad. There are several state elections for Senate races for Republicans that are coming on the board that were not conceivable being in jeopardy 6 months ago as a result of this bad polling data. So the data is real, the data are real, and those around the president who are trying to tell him the straight information are resigned to his unwillingness, at least currently, to accept that. Now, to this issue of the culture lines of battle that the president is trying to rhetorically draw. There's a couple of components to that. One is to try to get the country to forget about what it recoiled from just 3 weeks ago to 4 weeks ago. Lafayette Square, peaceful protesters, flashbang grenades, chemical irritants, and a Bible photo op. By creating this new conversation, or attempting to create this new conversation, Elaine, about these radicals, the anarchists, those who want to defile all of American values, the president is saying that's what you should really think about. Don't think about the thing that disturbed you that I did 3 or 4 weeks ago. Put that in the forget-me machine. Remember this thing and look at the statues, even those of the Confederacy. I'll defend those because from the president's point of view, and he's trying to shape this argument, I'm saving those, even though I'm really not that big on them, and maybe you aren't either, to save Thomas Jefferson and to save George Washington. Because if I give in on the Confederate statues, then George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and everything else will be toppled next. That there's a through line from Confederate statues all the way to George Washington. And if I don't stand on behalf of those Confederate statues, I'm not going to be defending George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and I'm going to do that. So his is a values argument in totality. Everything has to be protected, because if everything isn't protected, everything is in jeopardy. That is a very simplistic, it is hyper-political, and it is hyper-partisan. It essentially says anyone protesting in the street for racial justice, an end to police brutality, or certainly a reduction in police brutality, is part of this angry mob that wants to foment dissent, that wants to create waves of violence, his words, not mine, and draw this very, very sharp line. There is no nuance to it whatsoever. Now, Donald Trump has not been a nuance-heavy politician in his entire career, and he's certainly not now. But there is something important about this line of argument, Elaine, in that if the president is trying to enlarge his support, there are many Americans who don't count themselves as Trump supporters, who look at Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and say, yes, they were slaveholders, flawed. But they set so many things in motion that were redeemable, and our country has redeemed itself, and our country is about progress. But if we hadn't had that revolution against the Brits that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and so many others set in motion, we wouldn't have the fruits of this great country. And they are unnerved at this idea that everything about American history has to be washed away. And they are sensitive to parts of this president's argument that that's what this is about. And so there is a bit of up for grabs in this country about what this moment means and what defense of all of our values means. And I would observe that, for the most part, the president's political rival, presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden, does not wade into this. He does not stand on behalf of all those on the so-called radical left. He is not engaging in this debate with the president, except to say there are larger values that the president keeps missing, and the progress of America is part of our history, and there's more progress to be achieved, and we can learn some from our recent history and problems that we are still living with in terms of injustice and police brutality. But in the main, Joe Biden does not want to be a combatant in this argument that the president is making. That tells you that he wants to cede the worst part of this territory to the president and not try to engage directly, fearing he will be lumped in with the very forces the president is trying to demonize on the so-called radical cancel culture left.
Finally, Major, in our last minute left, millions of Americans are, of course, out of work, as we know. And I want to ask you about the economy. The White House reportedly wants a second stimulus package by the first week of August. What is the president's stake in coronavirus relief, and where do those negotiations stand now?
Right. Well, depending on how you count, it would be the fourth or fifth package dealing with the pandemic of an economic interventionist nature. And this is long overdue in the minds of some Republicans, and certainly in the minds of many Democrats. Remember, House Democrats passed the HEROES Act more than a month ago, almost 2 months ago now, a $1 trillion economic lifeline. What the White House has learned is that with coronavirus cases rising, an economic slowdown in being re-entrenched or reintroduced, if you will, U-turns on the reopening, let me just simplify it that way, there's going to be economic contraction. With economic contraction comes what? More joblessness and more economic despair. That cannot work to the president's benefit. He's got to combat that, and combat that as rapidly as possible, which means he has to engage with House Democrats on a stimulus package, which means they are going to have a voice. And part of that voice is going to be, do you re-extend unemployment benefits with that $600 plus up? The president might have to give ground on that. But the fact that the White House is now doing something that it hadn't done for weeks, which says this is a priority and must be done by August, tells you that the political reality of a contracting economy as it related to a resurgence of COVID-19 is real. You can sort of say that's where the White House actually knows about COVID-19. That it is resurgent in some places, that it is jeopardizing economic growth, and that the president and the Senate Republicans need to do something about it. That tells you all you need to know about actually what the White House believes about the current state of the virus.
An excellent point. CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett. Major, thanks as always. Really appreciate your insight.
Sure.